Poor Gerald Ford was elected in a time when the government was reacting against politicians in Washington because of the crisis with Watergate. So he was defeated when he ran for re-election by Jimmy Carter. And Jimmy Carter was kind of a different sort of president in that era. Jimmy Carter was he was a naval graduate, he was a nuclear physicist, he was a Southerner, like LBJ. He was a peanut farmer. He was a born-again Christian, so he had very strong values. His family had been in Georgia and had this peanut farm forever. He had a very informal style where some press conferences he wasn't even wearing a tie. He would wear, a dress shirt and a sweater. His daughter, Amy Carter, was around the White House a lot. His older son was already in the Navy at this time. Um, and because he was from outside Washington, he seemed like an attractive candidate. He was from Georgia. Unlike JFK, who'd been a senator, Nixon, who had been a senator and then vice president, Lyndon Johnson, who had been in the House of Representatives, Speaker of the House of Representatives and vice president, Carter, and Gerald Ford, who was Speaker of the House and also vice president. Carter was never in Washington, had never held a position in Washington. But this was bad for him because he had trouble. He didn't know how to navigate Washington very well. A lot of the people he brought in to work in his administration did not know how to navigate Washington very well. So they had trouble working with Congress and getting some of the things they wanted to get done. For him personally, his policies, the economy was struggling. What had happened in the Ford administration continued. The economy, inflation went up, and the economy struggled. He spent money to kind of get businesses going, gave them tax credits, gave tax breaks to middle class and lower class, put money back in their pocket. But this spending that the government took part in increased the deficit, and to offset that, he cut spending that the government had and for programs. He deregulated. Regulations is a type of government control on an industry. So he removed or reduced a lot of regulations that industries or companies or businesses had. He did that because he thought real strict regulations harmed the ability for a company to grow or to be innovative or to compete. Jimmy Carter was the first president since Teddy Roosevelt to make the environment a centerpiece of his administration. His big focus was on energy. He created new energy programs. His overall energy program had lots of different parts. One part was he wanted people to carpool, drive less, use less oil, so it would be less dependent on oil from foreign countries. He wanted us to turn down the heat in the wintertime and turn up the cool in the summertime, to use less energy and to make your home more efficient. He also created something we still have today, called the Department of Energy. He began to research, pump government money into universities and laboratories to research new energy sources like wind and solar and tidal. His National Energy Act actually put a tax, it's called a user tax, on cars that used a lot of gas. If you have an inefficient car, that's fine. It's your right to have it, but you are using more resources, and so you'll be taxed higher. He also deregulated the gas industry to make gas cheaper, he hoped. And he gave tax credits to homeowners that put solar panels on their roof or in their backyard, and that tax credit's still available. He also began to pump more money into research through alternative energy sources. One of those energy sources was nuclear energy, which was very popular in the 70s until an event called 3 Mile Island, which was in Pennsylvania off the coast. And 3 Mile Island had a misfunction, and one of the reactors began to leak radiation, and 140,000 homes were evacuated. Those homes nobody has still moved into. Those homes are still abandoned around 3 Mile Island, and that facility is shut down completely now. And we haven't had a big expansion of nuclear energy since then. In the United States, they still use it all the time in places like most of Europe and in Japan. In terms of civil rights, Nixon had dialed back civil rights, had began to dismantle some of the Civil Rights Act, parts of the Civil Rights Act, and Carter began to put them back in place. One of the things he wanted to do was to get people who were upset with the Vietnam War and who dodged the draft to come back to the United States. So he gave them amnesty, which means he pardoned them and told them you will not be arrested when you come home from Canada or Mexico or wherever you were. He also began to appoint a number of Hispanics and women and African Americans to government posts, both locally and federally, and he began to practice something we still have today called affirmative action, where you are increasing, sometimes forcing an increase in opportunities for minorities in different jobs, sectors of the job market, and in education. In terms of foreign policy, his biggest success was the Camp David Accords. This was a peace agreement between Israel and this Prime Minister Menachem Begin and Egypt and their president Anwar Sadat. Under Carter's guidance at Camp David, which is the presidential retreat up in the mountains outside Washington, he brought them all there. He brought those two men there and their cabinets, and they signed a peace agreement. It was the first peace agreement signed between Israel and one of its neighbors, and Egypt is the most powerful neighbor of Israel. That peace agreement is still in place today, although Anwar Sadat was assassinated a couple years after this peace agreement happened. With Russia, we began to look at human rights in Russia, and Jimmy Carter was a huge advocate of human rights around the world. He didn't like the way they treated their citizens. If you were criticized the Russian government, you were thrown in jail and often disappeared. There was no free speech, and Carter spoke out against that. When the Soviets invaded Afghanistan, the United Nations and Jimmy Carter asked that stop. Now, they invaded Afghanistan to prop up a corrupt dictator. We are in Afghanistan as well right now, but we are there to kill terrorists. We're still fighting the battles of 9/11 there. The U.S., in response to the invasion of Afghanistan, stopped sending grain, mostly wheat, to Russia. The USSR was so inefficient, so dysfunctional, it could not feed its own people and relied on the United States to send them food. In 1980, we boycotted the Olympics. 60 other countries did it too. Which was not a very popular move by the Carter administration at all. Carter's downfall, and the reason he didn't get reelected, is probably the Iran hostage crisis. It had very little to do with Carter, but it was a problem, and people were looking for a stronger military leader than Carter. In the Iran hostage crisis, the U.S. had supported for years an oppressive and corrupt. We put this guy in power. He's been known as the Shah of Iran, and he was the de facto ruler of Iran. A revolution broke out, led by Muslim extremists, mostly students, and they took over the American embassy, took 52 Americans hostage for 444 days, for more than a year. Carter did send commandos in to rescue them, but they hit a sandstorm in the middle of the desert. There you can see the wreckage of the helicopter, and that mission failed. So this was embarrassing. They had every night on the news, they had a countdown of how many days Carter had been, or how many days these hostages were taken. So people began to look around for a new type of government, and they found this new conservatism, which is Republicans mostly are conservative, although there are Democrats too. This was a reaction against the New Deal, against the policies of JFK and LBJ. Democrats had really controlled the White House for 20 years at this point. FDR was wildly popular during the New Deal, and many people against the government growth and increase in spending. Remember all these programs that FDR had started, all this money he had spent, people began to react against it. This led to the Eisenhower and Goldwater Republicans. Now, Ike slowed the government down, downsized the size, and made it smaller. Goldwater, who lost his bid for president, was a big star in the Republican Party, and he had support in the South, even though he was not from the South. And he was the guy who kind of flipped the South from Democratic to Republican. The Great Society programs of Lyndon Johnson, more government spending, more power from the government, those became unpopular with conservatives too. And here's why conservatives worry about a larger government and more spending. While the spending in government was going on, the Vietnam War was happening, and there were campus protests, and they thought this youth is getting out of control. the music culture of the 60s and 70s looked pretty strange to a lot of conservatives. And there was also something going on called the sexual revolution, which worried a lot of social conservatives. The women's movement threatened a lot of men, and a lot of times men are more conservative than women. And in the 1980 election, all these things that started with FDR, went through JFK and LBJ, came to a head with someone who was known as the great communicator, Ronald Reagan. In the 1980 election, conservatives wanted to change the size of government, wanted to shrink it. And they had a new ally in cable television, had created a new form of information called televangelists. Preachers who could go on TV and reach huge audiences. And one guy, one of those groups that had a huge audience was a group called the Moral Majority, called for return to traditional and biblical values. Their biblical values, not anybody else's. Ronald Reagan gets elected. He's an actor, a former governor of California, a Republican. He is an amazing communicator, very popular. He attacked Carter on the handling of the economy, on the handling of the hostage crisis in Iran, and he easily beat Carter in a landslide in the 1980 election. And the next lecture will be about Ronald Reagan. Republicans in that time also took over both the House of Representatives and the Senate, and it set Ronald Reagan up for something people call the Reagan Revolution.